The number two things you learned as when you were first hired on as a mechanical engineer at Blink and you scaled 100x from 250K to 40 million. That must have been
devices. Yeah, not dollars. That's devices. So
So operationally, I'm sure that was a lift. There was no lack of money at Amazon, which I think is always helpful. But tell me kind of about what you learned there going through that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it helped a lot to come from the startup mentality, which is doing a lot with a little. It's kind of, as they say, wearing a lot of hats, so I would step outside of my role just strictly as an engineer, and I would do things like procurement. Sometimes I toe the line on doing like financial stuff, like sending out purchase orders and whatnot.
Are you naturally adaptable like that? Because no offense, but engineers are not known for being adaptable, which is, I think, an interesting combo for you. You mentioned Elon Musk. I think Elon is a different type of engineer. I think he, is an engineer at heart, but I think he's even more so an entrepreneur and a mover and a shaker. But there are sometimes that's not the case with some engineers. I work with a lot of engineers being in real estate development. Do you think that you're molded a little bit different from maybe some of your colleagues or some other engineers that to be a little bit more adaptable?
Well, I think that's one of my strengths, is that I've always been extremely curious about pretty much everything. I've always wanted to learn about everything. And I find when you're curious about something, you learn it a lot faster. And, that curiosity has driven me to be able to pick new things up. Even like when I was getting into real estate, I would every single day probably spend 3 hours, between maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours in the car commuting, and then another hour or so listening to podcasts, reading books, reading articles.
What speed do you listen to podcasts on?
Usually 1x. There's a lot of information out there in the world, right? There's so much noise.
So you're right there, huh? You run it at...
Yeah, I like 1-to-1, normal, normal.
Generally a 1-to-1 or 2, or maybe I do 1.25. I was up at 1.5 sometimes, but I felt like it was too fast. And I like to hear how the human sounds, how they actually sound for some reason. And I know some guys that are like on 2 and, 1.5 minimum. And I don't know, it feels like I'm listening to, Alvin and the Chipmunks, dude.
Yeah, it's just too much for me. Like I said, there's so much information out there. Filtering that information is important for me. And sometimes that means slowing it down a bit to really digest it.
So talk to me a little bit about what you learned. You got into the finance side a little bit. You got into the operational aspect of it a little bit. And you grew from just being on the engineering side to, the way the business was being ran in a broader scale, getting from 250 units to 40 million.
At first, when we were a small team, I was doing a lot of that stuff. And I think without going into great detail about everything, which I could probably talk forever about, I learned how to do things, right? It's so important when you're running a business to just execute on stuff. You can do a lot of planning. And I think in the engineering world, depending on the size of the company, there's a lot of planning that happens and, trying to make sure that mistakes aren't made. But the mentality at a startup is we got to move or else we're going to die. So we got to do something. And if we fail, we'll just correct it. So it's kind of like the thing you said, the fail fast, fail forward. I just kind of learned how to execute.
Love that. You raised $400,000 in equity and you immediately started offering a return. Why you did that and how it created trust with investors initially when you got going that allowed you and more capacity to raise with additional investors, and I'm sure some of the same in the future. So tell me why you chose to do that, and was your approach based on it was longevity and you knew you were going to be in this for a while and you wanted to kind of earn your stripes, or what was your thinking, the reason why you approached it that way?
This was about a year ago. Yeah, I raised $400,000 in a month as part of a fund and then immediately tried to give it all back to people with interest. What had happened was we had been raising capital for this fund. We were going to deploy it in the multifamily space. It was kind of like a distressed owner acquisition fund or something like that, where we're going to go out, we're going to buy these properties that owners are having trouble with the debt or something else, where they need to get rid of it, and we're going to reposition them. And
where were these assets?
It was going to be in Denver. But what happened was the fund got pushed out about a year just because it was taking a lot longer to close on assets. the group I was working with had a predecessor fund that they still had to deploy before they could move on to this one. And I just decided that it was going to be best for investors to not wait around. So instead, offered them a couple different choices. One was to give all the equity back with interest for that month. And then I had 2 other deals that we were starting to put together that they could roll their capital into. And then the last option was to just leave it where it was and accrue the interest, which I felt like was a bad deal for them and a bad deal for me. And it built a lot of trust with people, because they felt like I wasn't just going to take their money to have it. It mattered to me to make sure that it was working in a good investment vehicle. And
yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I was a little bit confused about what you meant there. So basically, you raised capital for a fund. The fund had a previous fund. They still had to deploy capital from that fund before they could move on to the next fund. So that was taking time, as well as the assets they were acquiring. They weren't going as smoothly as you initially anticipated. So you decided, in the best interest of your clients, to move the capital or return the capital with interest.
Right. Yeah. To give people options to not keep their capital in the thing that I had pitched them because it had changed and it no longer made sense from my standpoint.
Got it. Yeah, that's commendable. And you said that helped you raise, that helped you raise capital in the future as well because it built trust with people. And, investors talk to each other at times. I'm sure the tech community where you're probably raising a bunch of capital, there's forums and boards and all this kind of stuff that people are going on and chatting about. And that probably helped you get a little bit more swag for your brand.
It did, yeah. I think everybody from that deal, they ended up reinvesting. Everybody did end up reinvesting in something else. And a lot of those people have, put more money into various deals since that happened. So for me, it was always about the long game, right? It was, what can I do today that'll build trust with people and allow that trust to compound and, eventually lead to them potentially wanting to work with me more.
Yeah.
So
that's the entrepreneur mentality, right? I'm thinking in longevity. I'm thinking in abundance. I'm thinking in, what's going to happen a year from now, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now. I'm not thinking a bird in the hand is better than 2 in the bush, right? Obviously, you have to make enough money to keep the lights on. You have to make enough money to be operational, right? But at the same time, you take care of your customers, your clients. I mean, all the biggest entrepreneurs, the guys we follow, Bezos, basically anyone who has really, really made it in this world is hyper focused on the customer. And in this case, when you're raising capital for deals and deploying that capital into funds, your client or your customer is the investor. So being focused on them makes a lot of sense. And in longevity, they continue to be successful, which, is what they're after. And it helps you be successful as well. So it's a partnership. So moving forward, we talked about Axel's Wallet, learned how to learn at MIT. You mentioned that, but you didn't break it down. Basically, it's a whole different system than you learned in high school about, I guess, an SOP for how to study and how to manage your time and how to take tests, etc.
Yeah, it's just problem solving. I think, and everybody goes through that in their own way. And especially if you're an entrepreneur, you have to learn these skills. For me, college was the place for that, because it went from just having to memorize stuff to actually figure out the whys behind things, right? So, that kind of, my curiosity helped a lot with that, and it set the stage for learning how to do a lot of other things, for instance, moving from engineering to real estate and some new stuff that I've dabbled in.
Love it, bro. All right. AI in your business. So tell me about AI and what you guys are doing now to implement it.
Yeah, well, right now we're recording this in May, which is relevant because this stuff's changing every single month at this point. It's getting better. Currently what we're doing is we're using AI to write a lot of our investor reports. So, we built out templates in Canva, which look nice. And we have cash flow statements and, rent roll statements that we can point AI programs to and say, hey, look at this template that we have and look at this past report that we did and look at this cash flow statement for this new month and build us out a report, based on all that information.
And you're trying to automate all that to save the legwork.
Yeah, kind of how I see my business being built is, so now I have, the person that's working with me, his name's Brendan. one of his roles is to take tasks off of my plate that, I can teach him to do. But the vision for those is not for him to stay with those tasks. It's for us to then look at his tasks and say, okay, which of these tasks can be automated? Let's go do that first, because once we automate it, it frees up our time, and it's the cheapest option, right?
Right.
The things that can't be automated, we say, okay, well, what can we delegate? Or what are these tasks can we give to somebody else that is relatively inexpensive but also specialized? So like we do that for things like website type stuff. We have somebody that we found on Fiverr that lives in Bangladesh who is a genius with web development, right? And anything that is in that realm, I don't want to be doing it. I don't want Brendan to be doing it. I'd rather, our guy over in Bangladesh to be doing it because he's better at it and it's also less expensive.
100%. And your time is better spent somewhere else.
Yeah. So, we've kind of siloed the business in that way. And as we scale up, we're getting better at it, where Brendan's sort of the filter for the task. I'm the originator, and I try to take like the high level view of the business on what needs to be done and what kind of verticals there are. And then my first task is to teach him. So it's systematized, because if I could teach it to him, there's now a process.
Right.
And then once he does it a couple times, his task is to further systematize it, either automate it or delegate it. Or
are you using like Loom? Are you using Loom or any other software to, when you're doing a task, you then relay that to him? Or are you showing him physically, or some of both? Loom is a really good tool for VAs that are virtual overseas, because sometimes they are very task oriented. So, you show them how to do something, you make a recording of it, and then they have a reference point. Are you doing that with Brendan, or is it more one-on-one?
Yeah, we use Loom, we use Slack. So Slack is kind of one of the central programs, because Slack integrates with a lot of things quite nicely. So like, for instance, you can make Loom videos, and then you can have those Loom videos sorted by AI into different channels in Slack, right? So like if I have a task related to website, I can make a video and basically tell the AI program, okay, put this into the website Slack channel. And it's also an app where you can, if you have partners in other things, like for instance, our banking partner uses Slack, we can have a Slack channel where I can communicate with them, and it's much faster than going through customer service.
Got it.
So we use Loom, we use Slack, we use a program called ClickUp, which is for creating tasks and sorting tasks. So it has like a board. And then, we're always looking for other ways to integrate different apps. And as you know, there's all sorts of things in business that you look at them and you think, if I could just automate this, like it seems simple enough, but like there are hundreds of those things, and we're trying to automate those things all the time.
I love it. So yeah, so I look at business, me personally, as an organism. It's always changing, and you're always trying to make it better. And sometimes it needs more water. Sometimes it needs more nitrogen in the soil. Sometimes it needs more sunshine. Sometimes, a car runs by and runs over, rips up some of the roots. You get the analogy. Like there's always something changing. You're always trying to make it better. And there's always, there's market conditions, right? And there's time, energy, effort, and all that. There's resources. I mean, there's so many things that go into, there's no business that's perfect. Another thing too, I'll tell you, for all you entrepreneurs out there, you can't look at someone else's business from the outside and think it's perfect. There is no business that's perfect. Apple has problems. And when you walk into Apple, it's really shiny and beautiful, and their marketing's amazing, their product's amazing. They have the best products probably in the world. But there are problems at Apple, and you can speak to that probably better than most, TJ, because you're at Amazon, which, you look at the old interviews from Bezos talking about how they built that company, and he's like, nothing worked. I mean, I think those were his exact words. He's like, nothing was going right, and they just kept going and kept going. And even now, there's challenges regularly, right? I'm sure.
That's my other favorite quote, is that everything is hard. Nothing is easy.
Nothing's easy, man. So, sometimes you can get enamored with another business, the way it looks, with, this other group or that other group or whatever. And it's a reason why not to try, a reason not to consistently, get better, or to get down on yourself. We're not doing good enough. But I would just say, as TJ alluded to, keep working super hard, keep learning, keep progressing, keep doing the things that you know to do. Listen to podcasts, listen to audiobooks, read books, go to meetups, all the things we talk about to consistently better, and then do the work and, document your experience, right? Take vlogs of videos when you're having tough spots, when, payroll numbers or COGS or fixed costs are ballooning, right? Or you need to get capital in to hit a deadline that you committed to. All these things that for real entrepreneurs are real things. We talk about them on the podcast because that's the real life that we live in, right? As TJ again talked about, there's no easy path to success. Every entrepreneur or person that, we're going to interview on this podcast, Skip the Lines, is really in it. They're really doing it. And when you get in rooms with people that are really doing it, I think there's an openness that happens. When you talk about things that are difficult and challenging, I think there's an openness. And I also think that a lot of our investors, TJ, get that too. And maybe they don't have a place where they feel comfortable enough to talk about that because, when you go out into the world, it's not the same way you look when you take your shoes off and you get home, right? So there's a balance there, from what you're showing the world as a business and what's really going on the back end, let's call it, in the closet or under the hood. So I like to share that because it makes people feel, I think, heard. It allows them to, show a little bit of, it's just challenges, right? It's not weakness. It actually takes strength to share that. And no one can help you guys unless you ask for it, right? If I don't know what TJ needs in his business, like when he approached Axel, he's like, this dude needs capital. Like if I didn't know that, then I can't offer any support. So sometimes it's good to be a little bit vulnerable and open about certain things because it will allow you to get help. Steve Jobs had a quote when he talked about that. He's never really had anyone tell him no when he asked for help. Someone's always, basically stepped up and helped him.